I was younger, my childhood home was the perfect spot for squad hangouts. There were several reasons for this. My dad had this massive man cave in the basement with what seemed like an endless supply of beer, and my parents were pretty cool about letting us drink down there. They generally left us to our own devices, which we loved. I lived on a large plot of land that bordered a decent-sized woods. If you walked through these woods from my house, you'd find yourself on a dirt road, and beyond that was the reservoir, a place that's held a special place in my heart since childhood. Over the years, I'd cut so many holes in the reservoir fence that the Water Commission eventually gave up repairing them. Even though it was technically illegal for civilians to trespass on reservoir property, as a kid, it was my sanctuary. I'd go there to smoke, escape from my parents, swim, or just think. It was truly a beautiful place, and probably the only thing I genuinely miss from that era of my life. One particular night, my friends and I were shooting pool in my basement, with some obnoxious EDM music blasting in the background, when my friend Chester had what seemed like a brilliant idea at the time. "Let's take a hike through the woods to the reservoir," he suggested. We were starting to get bored, so we all agreed. Plus, the sun hadn't set yet, so navigation wouldn't be a nightmare. There were 5 of us that night: me, Chester, Rick, Jasper, and Hassan. I can't remember all the details, but I'm pretty sure Rick and Hassan grabbed some beers for the journey. They were always the drinkers of our group. I'd already had a few drinks, so I didn't want to overdo it. The reservoir was huge, so even after crossing the fence, we still had quite a walk ahead of us. The woods were still a bit muddy from earlier rain, but we were already committed to the plan. There was this cliff on the near side where we usually hung out, so that's where we headed initially. After a while, though, we decided to keep walking and check out the far side of the reservoir. To get there, we had to walk along the near side to the end, cut across, and then walk along the far side until we reached this smooth section we used to call the beach. About 20 minutes later, we finally made it to the far side. That's when things started getting weird. Suddenly, Hassan raised his hand and pointed into the distance. Remember, we were on the far side of the oval-shaped reservoir, but hadn't reached the beach yet. Hassan was pointing to our right, where we could see something moving toward the reservoir on our same side, just much further down. The 5 of us went quiet and watched as this dark figure slowly made its way toward the water. At first, we were actually kind of excited. We usually welcomed these kinds of encounters. But as the figure emerged from the woods, we realized they were dragging something. The closer they got, the more we could see. Eventually, we realized what it was: a large black garbage bag that was clearly heavy, judging by how slowly the person was moving. Now, I don't want to jump to conclusions, but there had been a couple of bodies found in that reservoir over the years. In that moment, we quickly assumed the worst. We weren't smiling or talking anymore, just staring silently at the figure dragging what we feared was a body toward the water's edge. After reaching the water, the figure knelt down over the bag for several minutes. We couldn't exactly tell what they were doing from such a distance. We figured this was our chance to leave while they were distracted, but before we could move, Chester spotted something else that stopped us in our tracks. 3 more figures emerged from the woods. 2 were dragging bags, and the third was carrying a kayak over his head. My stomach turned. I lived only 10 minutes from one of the most crime-ridden towns in America, so if this was gang-related, it would have made perfect sense. The first man got into the kayak while the other 3 helped load one of the bags onto his lap. He paddled out to the middle of the reservoir, and we watched in horror as the garbage bag disappeared below the surface. He returned to shore and repeated this process twice more. Then, like a scene from a movie, my phone rang. The annoying ringtone cut through the silence like a razor blade, and my nervous hands couldn't mute it fast enough. The 4 men froze and turned in our direction. That's when we ran. Just like that, the sanctity of my backyard reservoir was gone forever. Rick glanced over his shoulder and yelled out, "They're following us!" It was the most terrifying moment of my life. Running through a forest is incredibly difficult. Factor in the threat of death and it's twice as challenging. We ran all the way back down the bank, cut across, and started making our way through the woods on the near side back to the hole in the fence. I don't know if it was the nerves, the alcohol, or both, but I couldn't remember where the damn hole was. I reached the fence first with my friends close behind, and they began panicking when they saw me tracing the fence aimlessly, searching frantically for a hole that could have been anywhere. We ran along the fence until Rick pointed ahead and shouted, "The hole was just a few feet away." As I was helping Chester through, we heard a tree branch snap not far behind us, and I knew they were closing in. The chase didn't end there. We ran through the woods all the way back to my backyard, and while we were relieved to have made it, the ordeal wasn't over. Hassan immediately called the police. We told them what happened, and they said they'd send a squad car right away. I knew I'd get in trouble for trespassing, but at that point, I didn't care. My friends were relieved to be safe, but I wasn't as relaxed. The path from the reservoir to my house wasn't very far, and they could have easily followed our tracks. When the police arrived, they listened to our story and searched my property for any signs that we were followed. My stomach dropped when they actually found something, a set of muddy footprints leading to my backyard fence. When they asked if I was sure they weren't ours, I told them, "Why would I jump my own backyard fence?" Thankfully, the police didn't find anyone hiding on my property. They left, promising to keep me updated about the reservoir situation. To my surprise, they actually did. A few days later, they fished out 3 bodies from the reservoir. No surprise there. It became a huge news story for a while. My parents and I were terrified for months, knowing these criminals knew where we lived. My mom constantly swore she saw people in the woods at night and even claimed to have seen a camera flash one evening. This incident was actually one of the main reasons we moved out of that house. Fast forward to today, and as far as I know, the police were never able to find any connections or make any arrests. I'm writing about this now because I recently came across a depressing news article about a teenager drowning in that reservoir, which brought all these memories flooding back. That place is definitely cursed, and I still wonder about all the tragedies that might have happened there that no one knows about. I'm an avid hiker, and I found myself exploring Utah during a cross-country trip I took after a painful breakup. I was 31 at the time, and the trip was my way of healing after discovering my girlfriend, who I had planned to propose to, cheating with one of my best friends. It was a double betrayal that left me wanting to get away from everything and everyone. Utah was one of the states I was most excited about visiting. The state is famous for its breathtaking forests that every serious hiker dreams of exploring. After some research, I chose Wasatch Cache National Forest as my destination because I'd heard amazing things about its natural beauty. What really drew me to this particular forest was how easy it was to find secluded areas. I've always preferred hiking alone. The peaceful solitude helps me think better. Crowded trails with tourists taking selfies just aren't my thing. I found an unmarked area of the forest and drove my car down this narrow dirt access road until I couldn't go any further. After parking, I stepped out to take in the stunning wilderness around me. I geared up with my hiking equipment and checked my phone. No service, which was exactly what I wanted. I made sure to remember where I'd parked and started my trek into the unknown. I know hiking alone in unfamiliar territory isn't the safest choice, but following marked trails has never given me the same sense of adventure. I always make sure to download digital maps of wherever I'm planning to explore beforehand. Most people don't realize that GPS still works without cell service. I bet you're thinking this is a story about getting lost in the wilderness. I wish it was that simple. What actually happened to me that day is something I still struggle to make sense of, even now. My goal was to reach a lookout point at the mountain summit, roughly 3 to 4 miles away. The terrain was challenging with steep inclines and rocky patches, so I was only managing about 1.5 miles per hour. About an hour into the hike, it started raining. Though it was just a light drizzle, hiking in the rain is something I absolutely hate. It's a major pet peeve of mine. Frustrated that my hike was cut short, I turned around and began retracing my steps. When I finally spotted my car in the distance, I felt relieved that this disappointing outing would soon be over. But that relief quickly turned to horror when I got closer. All 4 of my tires had been slashed. My heart started racing. There was no way this was a coincidence. Someone had deliberately vandalized my vehicle. I spun around, frantically scanning the forest in every direction, but saw nothing suspicious. I tried to listen for any unusual sounds, but the gentle rain hitting the leaves drowned out everything else. I considered my options. With no cell service, I was in a tough spot. I needed to find signal to call for help, but I remembered losing service about 20 miles back on the access road. Walking that distance seemed incredibly risky. I needed to find higher ground, and ironically, the lookout point I'd originally been hiking toward was perfect for that. Instead of taking the exposed road where I'd be an easy target, I decided to head back into the woods toward the summit. I'd covered about half the distance when I started noticing faint rustling sounds coming from behind me, maybe 40 yards back. The sounds would start and stop matching my movements. I didn't dare look back. I just walked faster, knowing I was probably more experienced at hiking than whoever was following me. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the trees. The rain continued falling, adding to my growing anxiety. After putting some distance between myself and my stalker, I risked a quick glance over my shoulder. I couldn't see anyone, but with countless trees providing cover, they could have been anywhere. Finally reaching the peak, I was incredibly relieved to find cell service. Without even taking a moment to appreciate the view I'd hiked so far to see, I immediately called the police. I explained my situation, the slashed tires, the stalking, everything. I mentioned I had AAA coverage and gave them precise directions to my car's location. Just knowing that someone knew where I was made me feel a little better. But I still had a massive problem. I needed to get back through the increasingly dark forest while avoiding whoever was out there. Walking straight back wasn't an option. That would be too predictable. After some quick thinking, I decided to try walking in a wide semicircle back to my car, hopefully avoiding any trap that might have been set. I walked parallel to the cliff edge for a while before entering the forest from a different angle. Since I hadn't scouted this particular area, I carefully studied the map on my phone, praying my navigation skills wouldn't fail me. Things seemed to be going well at first, no unusual sounds from any direction, but I spoke too soon. Just moments later, I heard a twig snap to my left. When I turned to look, there was nothing there. A few minutes after that, another sound came from directly behind me. That's when the terrifying realization hit me. There wasn't just one person out there, but multiple people hunting me through the forest. I picked up my pace to a light jog and then stumbled upon something that sent my fear levels through the roof. Hidden among the trees was a makeshift campsite with about 12 logs arranged in a circle around a recently used fire pit. Someone had definitely been here not long ago. I jogged around the camp and continued on, constantly looking over my shoulder. Minutes later, I heard something from my right and turned just in time to catch a glimpse of someone's foot disappearing behind a tree. That was all I needed to see. I broke into a full sprint through the woods, no longer caring how much noise I made. As I ran, the sounds around me grew louder and more frequent. They weren't trying to hide anymore. They were actively chasing me. Fighting the urge to look back became impossible, and when I finally did, what I saw chilled me to the bone. There were at least 6 people, all dressed in white, charging after me through the forest. I kept running, knowing my car couldn't be too far away. Those next few minutes were the most terrifying of my entire life. Imagine being completely exhausted, your lungs burning, but knowing that slowing down might literally mean death. Finally, I spotted my car, and behind it, the welcoming sight of a police cruiser with its lights on. I reached the officer's car and doubled over, nearly throwing up from exhaustion before I could even speak. When I looked back toward the forest, my pursuers had vanished completely. The officer told me he'd already called AAA, which was an enormous relief. While giving my statement, he shared something disturbing. Apparently, Utah has the largest Mormon population in the country, and it's not uncommon to encounter isolated groups living in unmarked forest areas. This particular forest, he explained, had a rich history involving various woods cults and religious groups. He believed I had accidentally stumbled upon one such group and scolded me for exploring an unmarked area alone. Looking back, the officer was probably right, but I still can't make sense of it all. If they were simply angry about me trespassing on their land, why not just tell me to leave? Why go through the trouble of slashing my tires and then hunting me through the forest like some kind of prey? This experience haunts me to this day, and I'm much more careful about where I choose to hike now. While I wouldn't call myself an expert hiker, I've been passionate about the activity for several decades now. I've conquered all the major trails in America and explored over 75% of our country's beautiful national parks. After so much hiking, I've had to find creative ways to keep the experience fresh and exciting. That's how I picked up an unconventional hobby, searching Google Maps for lesser-known, unnamed forests and exploring them. The added thrill of venturing into uncharted territory made it worth the risk of getting lost. Or at least, that's what I used to think. I developed a clever system to prevent getting lost. I carry these homemade route marking stickers that I stick onto trees as I go. They're completely removable, and I always make sure to peel them off on my way back to leave no trace behind. It's surprising more hikers haven't thought of this trick. It makes getting lost almost impossible. But this particular adventure was different. I had decided to explore Dudleytown Forest in Connecticut, a choice that would make most people think twice. If you're not familiar with it, the entire town has been abandoned since the 1800s, and there are countless creepy stories about strange occurrences there. You should look it up if you're into that kind of thing, but I'm not. I don't believe in supernatural stuff or ghost stories. The forest is technically off-limits to the public, but that hadn't stopped me before. In my mind, this meant I was guaranteed to have the woods to myself, which is exactly what I prefer. Being from New England, the drive wasn't too bad. I started my hike around noon to make sure I'd finish before sunset. My first impression of the woods was genuinely unsettling. I'd heard stories about the eerie silence there, but experiencing it firsthand was something else entirely. You don't really appreciate all the typical forest sounds until they're gone. Imagine closing your eyes in a completely silent room and hearing nothing but your own breathing. That's what it was like. While I'd encountered silent forests before, this felt different somehow. I continued walking, placing my stickers as I went, trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling the forest was giving me. I kept expecting to find some sign of wildlife or at least evidence that animals lived there, but found nothing. At one point, I was actually hoping to run into another person. That's how unsettled I felt. Eventually, the silence became more bearable and I started to feel calmer. But that peace was short-lived. Suddenly, I heard something that made my skin crawl. A sort of wailing or moaning sound like what you might imagine a wounded animal would make. Even now, I struggle to describe it accurately. It was particularly disturbing because it was the only sound in the entire forest. I stopped to listen, trying to rationalize what it could be. Maybe it was just wind whistling through the trees, but there wasn't any wind that day. I tried convincing myself it was probably just an injured animal, even though deep down I knew that wasn't right. I walked away until the sound faded, but you're probably wondering why I didn't just leave right then and there. I wish I had a good answer for that. I promised myself that if one more weird thing happened, I'd turn back. As I walked, my mind raced with questions. If it was an injured animal, how did it get hurt? Was someone hunting here illegally? I definitely would have heard any gunshots. Maybe they'd taken the shot before I arrived. But would a hunter really leave an animal suffering like that? While lost in these thoughts, I came across something that made my blood run cold. The tree directly in front of me had carvings on it. Not your typical initials or hearts, but strange symbols. They didn't look like any letters I'd ever seen, just random slashes and gouges in the bark. When I looked around, I saw that several nearby trees had similar markings. That was the final straw. I turned around immediately and started heading back, removing my trail markers as I went. Despite my naturally curious nature, even I knew it was time to get out of there. I followed my markers for a while until I spotted something in the distance that I hadn't seen before. what appeared to be a bear's den or some kind of cave. I stopped, confused. I know myself well enough to know I wouldn't have missed something that obvious earlier. That's when the horrifying realization hit me. My trail markers should have been at shoulder height, not waist height. My heart nearly stopped. Someone had moved my stickers, trying to lead me toward that cave. But how? Had someone really been following me this whole time without me noticing? I didn't waste time thinking it through. I turned and started sprinting back the way I came, constantly looking over my shoulder. I'd been so careless, and now without my proper trail markers, I was completely lost. I kept running, not even trying to be quiet anymore. What was the point? The forest was still dead silent except for the noise I was making. When I stopped to catch my breath, I pulled out my phone, desperately hoping for a signal. By some miracle, I had one bar. I quickly located my parked car on the map and figured out which direction to go. The signal dropped immediately after, but it didn't matter. I knew where I needed to head. That's when the wailing started again, twice as loud as before. I ran faster than I ever had in my life. Even though years of hiking had kept me in good shape, I was pushing my limits. The sound seemed to be coming from right behind me, but every time I looked back, there was nothing there. After what felt like the longest 10 minutes of my life, I finally reached the edge of the forest, and the wailing stopped abruptly. I jumped in my car and sped away before whatever had been chasing me had a chance to catch up. That experience ruined hiking for me. Here's my rational explanation for what happened. Some hermit or forest dweller lives in those woods and spotted me before I noticed them. For whatever reason, they followed me and messed with my trail markers, trying to lure me toward that cave. They probably had some kind of whistle or device that made that wailing noise, which explains why it stopped so suddenly when they realized they couldn't catch me. I know there are holes in this explanation, like how could someone blow a whistle while running at full speed for that long? I'm open to other theories. Maybe there's a very good reason that forest is off limits to civilians after all. Some mysteries are better left unsolved.